Thanks, Rob, very much. And I really appreciate the opportunity to serve as a discussant today on Rob's talk. I'm going to focus most of my comments on the 2015 SOFA report on social protection and agriculture, in part because it links so closely to some of our own research here at IFPRI. And I want to talk a little bit about where that research is headed and some reflections for FAO in terms of how they think about this, and I have a few questions maybe for Rob for things that we are finding hard in this space to think about. But I'll start just by saying a great thanks to FAO for making this topic, social protection and agriculture, the focus of the 2015 SOFA report. So we were already moving in the direction of developing new research in this area, but really pretty new. And we can't reach the same audience that FAO can reach. But the fact that they made social protection a real focus of this report means that a lot of people, including in ministries of agriculture, but a lot of people who are very focused on agricultural programming, I think are going to wake up and sort of see the potential for linking social protection to agriculture. So that's incredibly valuable to us, and because we see it as a really important area of research and of new programming. But it's different for them to hear it from FAO than to hear IFPRI researchers telling them that in a small meeting. So that's a big thanks. In addition to that, I think the report does a really excellent job actually of laying out the case for an important linkage between social protection and agriculture. They make, as Rob has done here, they make the case for exactly why it matters. There's so much link between where poverty exists and that in rural economies, agriculture is still the driver of economic growth and development in so many places. And yet we have, in many of these places, a breadth of social protection programs going on, a lot of investment in agriculture, of course, and yet the two act as if they're not related. And in terms of programming and in terms of government ministries, management, they don't speak to each other very much. And we find that there's a lot of lost gains, we think, from not making more complementary investments. So the report does a really nice job of laying out the case for this and explaining just what the mechanisms are for how social protection and different types of social protection programming can have an effect on agriculture, and the two can essentially twin and help each other. So in terms of making the case, I think it's really nice. But also, they build a nice evidence base. So there's a lot of, just as you saw here, they pull from some specific social protection programs to look at what their effects on agriculture were, but just kind of use a lot of cross-country data to summarize what I think comes out to be a pretty compelling case. Thank you, and we thought that was a job really well done. I wanted to mention, so we were invited to contribute to the background work research for the SOFA report, and were commissioned to write 2 background research papers. Some of my colleagues at IFPRI, so Melissa Drobo, John Hodnott, Naya Kumar, and Megan Olivier, drafted 2 separate reports. One was on getting the evidence on social protection and food security, and reviewing that evidence, and others on social protection and asset accumulation. So I just wanted to sort of flag those, and that research is also available if people are interested. So we were grateful to also be included in the dialogue that led up to this report. Now I want to just take a few minutes to talk about some of our upcoming research in this area, which is very much motivated by the same things that were just discussed in Rob's talk. The timing of this couldn't have been better from our standpoint. A big CGI research program is the PIM research program, led by Karen Brooks is here. The Policy Institutions and Markets Research Program has as one of its flagships work on social protection. And we are in the midst of a very active process of setting up our next research phase, which begins in 2017. And one of the leading areas of research that we're proposing to do in that is on linking social protection and agriculture. So the timing of this was fantastic, and you'll see when our proposals are out and available for public consumption that we cite the SOFA report widely. So again, you've done us a favor. When in that area, as we look at sort of what we think should be done on social protection and agriculture, we essentially have kind of 2 big pieces. The first is to build up the case for what social protection programming, kind of as it looks now, is doing in terms of improving agricultural investment, take-up of agricultural technologies, and agricultural productivity. And so if you look at the evidence on social protection and its impacts, it's one of the most well-documented areas of research in terms of the impacts of major public investments related to poverty. There's just been an awful lot of kind of research in social protection grew up at the same time as, as the wave of interest in impact evaluation. And so you have a lot of information summarized well here and elsewhere on the impacts of social protection on food security, on asset accumulation, on household consumption growth, and then less so, but on some other intra-household issues, for example, and related materials, much of which IFPRI has also been very involved in studying. Where we find less evidence, and so these are kind of the two big areas that we're proposing to work on next, is one on the effects of social protection on nutrition. So not just diet and food security, yes, that's been studied and it's well documented and there are big effects. On nutrition, the story is much more complex and you find a lot of programs where there's no effect on child nutritional status. And sometimes there is, often there isn't. And part of the reason is that there's no attempt to make an explicit objective out of improving child nutritional status, and there's no explicit nutrition program. And so to some extent it's not a surprise. Well, the same can be true, can be said and is true of looking at social protection in agriculture. We have been running social protection programs targeted at poor households whose primary income sources are agriculture without necessarily thinking very much about whether we could improve the designs of those programs for improving agricultural investment, or just whether there's an effect at all. So the evidence on social protection and nutrition is actually a bit richer than social protection in agriculture, where people have mostly stopped, even IFPRI studies, at sort of looking at asset accumulation, but not so much on agricultural productivity. So the first thing we want to do is work with some of our existing data sets. We have a number of data sets from experimental studies that we've run. Some of them are long-run panel data sets, particularly in Ethiopia and Bangladesh, where we want to go back and essentially revisit those data sets and look at the effects of some very large-scale social protection programs on agriculture. So in Ethiopia, starting in 2006, we collected data there for the beginning of an ongoing impact evaluation of the Productive Safety Nets program. And we collected data every 2 years through 2014. And that phase of that research has ended. And that's a very good data set to actually look at this question. So that's one of the things that we'll do. And just part of the question there is, are we getting more out of those social protection transfers than we think? And is there an effect for households of actually improving their agricultural productivity? The preliminary evidence out of that is that those effects are actually quite small. And so that raises the potential of maybe changing the way we design social protection programs to improve those effects. Some of the impact pathways through which social protection might affect agriculture are many, and it varies a bit by program. But the first couple mentioned here are primarily about risk mitigation, and that's a potentially substantial pathway. Uninsured risk, I think, is one of the major problems in development for the poor. And they simply don't have access to the kind of insurance instruments that most of us enjoy ourselves in terms of health insurance or insuring our homes from disaster and things like that. And so social protection fills that void in many cases. You can increase resilience to shocks. It could be from climate change, conflict, price fluctuations, and there's some new evidence, IFPRI evidence on that, which is quite interesting. There is good evidence that social protection transfers reduce distressed asset sales, and that's encouraging too. Funding for input purchases could just be a very direct way through which social protection could improve agriculture. In public works projects, those are actually designed where many of the assets that are being produced are community assets that actually could support agriculture. One of the most popular ones of the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia is actually soil and water management. That's one of the things that those works teams do most. And then otherwise, investing in human capital, and this is an avenue of that link between social protection and agriculture that I think is underappreciated or underreported. We know that social protection increases in attendance at schools, It improves schooling. It can improve cognitive development. We have evidence on that. If it can be designed to improve nutrition too, then we're talking about really substantial investment in human capital. You're improving the abilities of tomorrow's workforce, who are going to be your agricultural laborers, your farmers, your decision makers. Okay, so that's one area in which we intend to work. The next is really this next issue about designing agricultural programs and social protection programs to be complementary. And that requires a really new kind of thinking. So monthly cash grants may not be the way to go if our focus and our interest is to improve agricultural productivity. Or it may be, so once you start backing off of monthly cash grants, so that's a slightly dangerous thing to say, right? Because there's quite a bit of consensus around that modality. And as Rob said, we also have research that supports the idea that regular payments, periodic payments of a reasonable size really help households to make the best use of those transfers. So I don't want to kind of throw that away. And yet there may be some very cost-effective changes in modalities that could be made that could really improve the effect of social protection for agriculture. Things like timing the transfers around the timing of input purchases, or explicitly stating to households that things like nudging and labeling of transfers to say, we're giving this to you now because we know it's your timing when you're buying your inputs, and we want to make sure that you have the resources that you need. Other evidence has shown that linking the harvest money by creating an instrument where people take the money that they get at harvest and essentially promise to use it for buying inputs in the next season, have been very effective, and they're very inexpensive. Well, you could use social protection transfers to essentially incentivize exactly that behavior, but among poorer households. One of the benefits of linking social protection and agriculture is that we think you can move the adoption profile for all kinds of agricultural technologies lower down the income distribution. Right now, a lot of poor households are not taking advantage of technologies that we think they could if we tried to twin social protection and agriculture in this way. So we think that's also worth looking at. Last is just to explore social protection strategies to promote other ways of promoting rural development. Rob mentioned this also, that social protection actually helps on migration, and in some ways it can be used to actually design temporary seasonal migration to access labor. So I think that's something else that should be considered. So thank you for the opportunity. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how this work is important to us, and thank Rob and FAO again for the report. I jotted down a few questions for Rob to kind of help kick off our Q&A period. Some of these are just things that as I mentioned, that I think are hard about social protection and agriculture, and I'm just kind of curious about the extent to which FAO is thinking about this, or sort of how you see some of these things. So I have three. I'll try to be quick. So first, many programs promoting agricultural investment are essentially market-led programs, or they're run through extension services by the ministries of agriculture. Whereas social protection, for the most part, are government-led, run by other ministries, and are not really market-driven at all. So as we try to think about how to twin the two and bring them together, what is FAO thinking about kind of strategies to actually bring the two together? Do we expect that ministries of agriculture are ready to kind of get involved in the social protection business, or would it be handed over? In Ethiopia, you're actually seeing a handing over from Ministry of Agriculture to the Bureau of Labor and Social Affairs as they start to change the targeted outcomes, as they try to make their programs more nutrition sensitive. So should we be expecting that? And I worry about the transaction and transition costs there. Second is related to something that you mentioned about regular periodic payments, where I see that those remain important, and yet I think in terms of cost-effective behavior change around agricultural investment, that's not going to look like that. We have to actually target transfers at specific behaviors, not through conditionalities the way we condition education in social protection, but through explicit tie-ins. And I wonder whether you think that's, to some extent we have to borrow resources off the monthly cash grants to make that possible. Just wondering whether you guys have thought about that much, and I see some kind of cost-effective improvements coming out of that, but it's risky. Last is on gender. And as I said, I don't know that there's great answers on this yet, but this is something that we're struggling with, which is essentially how to account for gender and make good use of program designs once you start twinning social protection and agriculture. Many social protection programs are targeted to women, and in part because those transfers are more likely, we know, to actually be spent on child outcomes as well. Most agricultural investments are not gender targeted at all. And again, some of them are just there available to you in the market. So as we start to think about bringing the two together, the gender implications are pretty complicated. We've seen good research showing that once you start targeting certain agricultural investments to women, that the intra-household dynamics can shift in ways that don't necessarily benefit women. It can get to be a pretty complicated story. I see potential for upside if you, by targeting transfers to women and trying to sort of change the dynamics about how agricultural investment decisions are made. But I think it's complicated. So, okay, I'll stop there. Thanks very much.